Thank you for being here with us. We're so happy you've joined us. We have a great program for you. My name is Barbara Ungert. I am the marketing manager for APA Journals. I'm joined today by my colleague, product analyst and APA style expert, David Kofalt, as well as our two guest speakers, both who have been heavily involved with APA style JARS over the years, Drs. Heidi Levitt and Arthur Nezu. Our goal for the webinar is to share the benefits of adherence to APA-style JARS from the perspective of APA Journals editors and JARS experts. So just to give you a little bit of an idea of what the webinar will entail, we'll start out with two audience poll questions, followed by an introduction to JARS by David, then our panelist presentation and discussion, and then our audience Q&A. Few housekeeping items before we start. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand. We will send you all an email to let you know how to access the recording. The slides and additional resources will also be shared with all webinar registrants. In fact, you can go to the resources tab now and you should see links to various JARS-related items, as well as information about the speakers. And lastly, we welcome your questions throughout the webinar. Just use the Q&A box. Our APA-style experts, Chelsea Lee and Tim McAdoo, will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the webinar. Okay, so on to the audience polls. Our first poll is we'd like to get a little bit of information about your background, your professional background. So what is your professional role? Are you a student, a researcher, an instructor, or all of the above? So please select all that apply. We'll give everyone a few seconds to respond and share the results. You see a lot of researchers, a lot of instructors as well, and graduate students, so a really good mix. Okay, awesome. All right, so as you see, we do have quite a lot of psychology researchers and graduate students and instructors, journal editors as well, undergraduates, great mix. Yep, thank you all for being here. And as for our second question, we are interested in how familiar you are with JARS. We're curious. So yeah, so please let us know. Have you used APA-style JARS? Maybe you've never heard of it before. We'd love to know. Okay, wow, it's really quite even throughout among the three answers. Nice. Okay, it's a really good mix. So hopefully both those who are familiar and those who are less so will come away with having learned something valuable from today's webinar. Okay, so thank you for participating in the polls. And with that, I'll turn it over to David for an introduction to JARS.
All right, great. Thanks, Barbara. Hi, everybody. Let me get to our introduction. So APA-style journal article reporting standards, or APA-style JARS, or just JARS, are a set of standards designed for journal authors, reviewers, and editors to enhance scientific rigor in peer-reviewed journal articles. In a nutshell, the standards provide a step-by-step guide on what information to include in a research paper. In that way, the goal of APA-style JARS is to promote transparency and, for some types of research, replicability. The standards are available for quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research. Since JARS were revised in 2018, they continue to grow and evolve. In 2023, we introduced APA-style JARS for race, ethnicity, and culture, or JARS-Rec, to provide guidance on how to discuss race, ethnicity, and culture in scientific manuscripts for all research designs. All standards are freely available and can be found at apastyle.apa.org/JARS. So what are some suggestions offered by APA-style JARS? The standards are formatted as tables and take you through the manuscript from start to finish. They offer guidance for both authors and reviewers. So for example, In the article title, list the key topics, variables, or issues under investigation. In the abstract, indicate the study design, including participant characteristics, analytic strategy, findings, and conclusions. In the methods section, include a rationale for why you selected a particular design and describe the participant selection process. In the discussion section, discuss implications for future research, policy, or practice, and so on. Recommendations vary depending on research type and design. There are many different JARS tables, including those for longitudinal studies, N-of-1 studies, and Bayesian statistics, to name a few. For those looking for more in-depth information about APA-style JARS, we have printable versions of all JARS tables, informational videos, a JARS glossary, related books, and much more available on the JARS website. And links to additional resources can be found in the webinar description and will also be shared with everyone post-webinar. So now to learn more about their thoughts on and experiences with JARS, we'll turn it over to our panelists. Our panelists are Dr. Heidi Levitt. Dr. Levitt is editor of Qualitative Psychology. She's a professor in the clinical psychology program within the Department of Psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She was the chair and an author of the 2018 American Psychologist article, Journal Article Reporting Standards for Qualitative Primary, Qualitative Meta-Analytic, and Mixed Methods Research in Psychology. And she's author of the book Reporting Qualitative Research in Psychology, How to Meet APA Journal Article Reporting Standards, Revised Edition. And we have Dr. Art Nezu. Dr. Nezu is editor of Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice. He's Distinguished University Professor Emeritus of Psychological and Brain Sciences at Drexel University. And he's an author of the 2018 American Psychologist article, Journal Article Reporting Standards for Quantitative Psychology. So now over to our panelists. So Dr. Levitt, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. If you want to advance, happy to be here and to get to talk to you about JARS. There's been a long history of APA having quantitative journal article reporting standards that has historically been incredibly helpful for aiding researchers in presenting their research and creating expectations about what should be presented and how it should be talked about. But it's really only in this last revision of the JARS that we've introduced qualitative journal article reporting standards and mixed method, and also qualitative metasynthesis and meta-analysis. And we did it in a certain kind of way. So that APA was really, I think just in doing this, right, APA was differing from what we have done before and from some other professional standards that don't recognize differences in methodological, epistemological kinds of approaches. But we also are, even within the JARS, encouraging people to think about their approaches to inquiry, approaches to research, and thinking about how to adapt and develop their methods so they're coherent with the specific studies that researchers are conducting. Next, please. So in the beginning, there was hesitancies about this. There were articles written saying, wondering if it's even possible to create journal article reporting standards, and also recommendations for research design and review that are common, that hold across qualitative methods, because there's so many different methods that have different epistemological perspectives, different ideas of what processes should be used, different languages, right? And so there was a lot of hesitancy and concern at the beginning. But what was really innovative and helpful about the standards was that, and here's really thinking about the qualitative standards, is that we place the issue of methodological integrity at the center. And this is at the center of both the Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology's recommendations for design and review of qualitative methods, and which were sort of incorporated into the journal article reporting standards. And so the issue, by placing the issue of methodological integrity at the center, what this means is that we're saying that we expect that researchers should be adapting their procedures and methods to help them develop stronger answers for their specific studies. So thinking about what it means to have great fidelity in your study, to have research findings that really reflect the experience that you're studying, and thinking about wanting to have great utility for your findings, meaning that you want to have findings that are useful and useful for the purposes that the researchers have for them, right? We realize that this is going to be different in different studies and with researchers with different goals. So, for instance, if I'm doing research from a perspective where I'm focused on wanting where I'm taking a critical lens, where I'm focused on social justice, and I want my findings to be raising consciousness or changing societal structures or doing things that will allow changes to happen in the world to benefit social justice. Those are different goals than if my goal is to develop a hypothesis or to understand a theory better. So a main focus across the JARS is to think about how we develop fidelity and utility and how we think about them carefully um, in relation to our goals and in relation to our participants, not just by following rules. Next slide, please. So because of this, there's a very strong emphasis on transparency, right? Because your goal as a researcher should influence the methods that you use. And because of this, there's a focus in the JARS on reflexivity. And reflexivity means not only being aware of who you are coming to a research project, right? I see often people will write about reflexivity, will write these reflexivity statements where they just list off characteristics of themselves. Like I am this kind of researcher. I am a white woman, lesbian researcher, Jewish, whatever it is, right? Um, but what we really mean by reflexivity is thinking about how your positionalities, your experiences have influenced the way you approach your study. And also to think about not only how they might have influenced it, but what did you do to um, to be careful that those ideas and perspectives weren't influencing you in a way that made you less observant of your participants' experiences, right? Or it could be that your experiences and positionalities helped you to be better aware of your participants' experiences. But it's that level that's important in these reflexivity statements, thinking about not only who you are, but how does that affect the research? How does it, and what do you do about it, right? Another example of transparency is situatedness. So the idea here is really thinking about qualitative meta-analyses and meta-syntheses, in which a researcher, you may be reviewing many, many qualitative articles. And here you want to be reflective not only on your own positionalities and contexts, but also those of the researchers of the primary studies. So if the researchers um, in the studies that you're examining all had a similar perspective, or all were looking at similar kinds of participants, or most of them were holding a certain attachment to a certain theory, those would be the kinds of things you'd want to be talking about and framing, and also thinking about what are you going to do with respect to those limitations. Um, so, uh, so the JARS are really meant to support researchers in thinking about the epistemological perspectives they have. What are the aims that they have, right? So I mentioned before, critical researchers, constructivist researchers may have different kinds of aims and questions, and to try to think about how the methods you're using fit well for the perspectives and the goals that you have. This is a lot of what you're going to be wanting to describe in your method sections in qualitative papers. Next slide, please. Okay, so as editor of Qualitative Psychology, but not only we, like a lot of journals are doing this, APA journals and also journals outside of APA are directing authors to look at JARS on their submission pages. And so we encourage authors we have a link to the JARS on our submission pages, so authors can easily access them. You don't have to go to our webpage. You can just access them directly because they're open access. And then we encourage reviewers also to think about the JARS as they're doing the review for our journal. And so that way they're thinking about, are the papers well described? Are the methods coherent and clear and transparent? Um, and uh, and so another thing I wanted to mention, I guess, in closing is just that part of the motivation for these articles was to really help authors. So to help authors be clear about what they should be including in papers, what's important to include in papers, and also to address problems in terms of misunderstandings. So sometimes you may be using a method that isn't the dominant method in psychology. Qualitative methods generally isn't the dominant method in psychology. And then some qualitative methods are less used than others. And so your work may be misunderstood. And people may try to apply inappropriate standards, right? And so a goal of the development of both the SQIP recommendations on methodological integrity and the JARS was to help authors have a clear idea of what is expected and also to flag when different standards should be used, right? Different standards for qualitative, different ones for quantitative. Within qualitative, some designs may present their research in one way, other designs in another way. And so we try to flag these sorts of differences so that people reviewing the research can know about it. And also so that authors can then cite those standards and say, I'm using this approach, and this is the difference in terms of how my approach should be read and should be represented. The SQIP recommendations on methodological integrity were developed really specifically thinking about the most common misunderstandings that reviewers bring to qualitative papers and writing out responses that authors could use to respond to those misunderstandings. So just to think of these as resources that were really developed for you to help you in promoting your work and communicating. Thank you.
Okay, I'm not going to ask to forward any slides because I don't have any. And I apologize for that, but what I didn't want to do is have slides that kind of were redundant. So let me talk a little slower so that you don't need slides to hear what I'm saying. Excuse me. I think one of the things that Heidi kind of really emphasized is that this is almost like a meta understanding of how to approach research, very broad-based understanding. And that becomes really important because JARS is not something that is a requirement, that if you don't have this piece of information, you're automatically doing something wrong. And to think of it in parallel with what is science, and science in terms of its methodology and how to conduct research, as well as in statistics in terms of how you evaluate the results. Neither of them are written in stone. It evolves. And I think JARS, so at least in terms of the JARS-Quantitative, that actually represents a revision of the original JARS. And the qualitative and mixed methods was an acknowledgement, obviously, of the evolution of a number of different ways that psychological research can be conducted. I think it's kind of important to just give a little bit of a background of some of the influences. So there's a lot of different forces that were in play over the past couple of decades as to why something like JARS or standards and guidelines become important. Because I was raised as a clinical psychologist, that tends to be where most of my headset and framework about research is placed. But for those of you who are unfamiliar, there was this concept called consort guidelines, and that stands for Consolidated Standards of Reporting Trials. That's consort. CONSORT. And where that came from was decades ago, a number of editors of medical journals, publishers, and researchers who did clinical trials of medical procedures wanted to develop a method by which they can evaluate the comparability of different approaches. So, for example, is this intervention more efficacious than this intervention? Is this medication more effective than that medication? And what they found, unfortunately, was there was no set of guidelines that existed that allowed researchers to actually look at journal articles to be able to compare them because they lacked a lot of the same kind of pieces of information having to do with the intervention itself or the subjects, etc. So they developed this thing, and that's why it's called for reporting trials. And there's a tendency in clinical psychology for randomized clinical trials for the recommendation to be, let's use consort guidelines. But consort guidelines tended to be focused predominantly on medical interventions. And while there's some overlap, it really did not take into account a whole lot of psychological phenomena. Now, the wonderful thing about JARS, especially in terms of all the different variations presently, is that it cuts across all different kinds of psychological research. So it's not just RCTs or clinical trials. It could be complex things, for example, like correlational studies, time series studies, replication studies, as well as clinical trials. But again, as kind of being indicated, is that the notion of JARS guidelines helps people to understand what kinds of pieces of information should be contained in research reports. But as someone who has taught research to doctoral students for, I don't know, centuries, Abe Lincoln was one of my, co-teachers. The idea is that I tend to think of JARS not only in terms of reporting research, but also helps you to make decisions about what kind of research you're going to do, as Heidi kind of indicated, but how you're going to go about it. And I think especially for those of you who are instructors or professors and teach these courses, I have found JARS across all the different kinds to be a phenomenal teaching tool. One of the things is that throughout my activities doing research, I've come across a number of military pilots. And why am I bringing that up? One of the things that they mentioned to me was, especially if they've been doing this for the longest time, they have all the different kinds of checks about, is a plane ready to take off? Obviously, is there enough fuel? Is the tires, correct, et cetera, et cetera. But what they do is they have a checklist. And what that checklist helps them to do, even if they haven't memorized, is to be guaranteed that they're going to make sure that they go through that checklist. And so that, again, everybody is safe to be able to take off. Now, I'm not saying that research is the same thing, that it's a life or death situation, but what the JARS really does is to suggest these are the pieces of information that should be included. And when the JARS was being developed, and different researchers and journal editors were asked for some of the feedback, one question was, why do I need to say something like, my study was IRB approved? Everybody does that. And in fact, not everybody does do that. And more researchers from across the world are submitting their research reports to American journals. And IRBs are not called IRBs in every country. So it becomes important for everybody to indicate whatever the name of the department or component is, to say that it was actually reviewed for ethical standards. Standards becomes really important. For the JARS quantitative, I was kind of the lead person on including or doing the tables in the section on RCTs in the clinical part. And the reason why I think that was very important is one of my criticisms of the whole field of mental health in terms of RCTs and interventions is that we tend not to really talk about side effects or adverse events, etc. Now, if something that was very serious, like a suicide death, of course, people report that. But just talking to a lot of patients and clients, they might complain that although this particular intervention is very effective, I have two jobs, or I have, it took me too much time to be involved in this. And that's a side effect. So when we think about the benefits versus the cost of a particular intervention, um, that's part of how we can evaluate the overall worth or quality of a particular psychotherapy or counseling approach. So the idea is that JARS, for example, a little tiny thing on one of the checklists is please indicate adverse events or side effects, whatever they are. So those kinds of things helps us to remember these are things that we should include. I also think that it has a huge impact on synergy of ethics. And as APA is coming out with a new whole ethics code, and I think that there's a huge amount more having to do with research in the new code than the old code, it becomes really important, not only in terms of how we treat um, human subjects or animals in our research, but also in terms of the way in which we do research and to prevent scientific misconduct. I think at this point, I'm going to be quiet. I think I took enough time, so I'm allowed everybody to answer questions or ask and answer questions. But if there's something that I missed that you think is important from the quantitative perspective, please feel free to ask that. But thank you very much. I'm so happy to see so many people come to this who are interested in JARS. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Nezu. Thank you, Dr. Levitt, for your statements and providing insight onto, your involvement in JARS and some insight in how to use JARS and why JARS could be important and are important. So we received a lot of great questions ahead of time, and we've got some really great questions that are coming in. The first question, which tends to be a question we get a lot, it's a question that we actually have featured on the JARS FAQ. It's one that we see a lot and got several variations of it here, and we actually provide a blog post in the link on it. Is with a lot of the discussions with JARS and looking into the importance of JARS and communicating transparency or being transparent in research, how would a researcher balance that transparency with paper length? What do they do? How do they prioritize what the most important things to provide to a reviewer would be? How do they know what, if anything, to leave out? We had someone in the comments or in the Q&A say, there are aspects of JARS that feel overwhelming because, we do mention a lot. So if you two want to speak a bit to that. So again, just to kind of make that question a little bit more concise, how do we balance transparency and, what to include or what not to include in a paper?
You want me to talk to that?
Sure. Yeah. Go ahead, Dr. Levitt.
So, with the JARS-Qualitative, there's a item saying, you should be reporting on your reflexivity. You should be thinking about situatedness if you're doing a meta review. And really, there's a couple of issues here that are folded together that make this difficult. One issue is that often journals have developed standards for journal article page lengths that are really meant for quantitative research and that are not appropriate for qualitative research. So in the JARS, we recommended a 45-page manuscript, not a 30-page or a 35-page manuscript. The reason why is because you need to have a lot of information to understand what's happening in the analytic process in qualitative research, and also because people usually will show quotes. I'm going to give you a two-part answer. So one part of the answer is you can write to journal editors and you can say, my paper is longer than a typical manuscript because I'm doing a qualitative study. And, it's within the 45 pages recommended by the JARS. And that's a way to advocate for yourself at the beginning. And some journals have already set it up so that most manuscripts are 35 pages and qualitative ones are 45. So some journals have already done that for you, but you can advocate for yourself for more space. Actually, I'm going to give you a three-part answer. The second part, the second part is that you can figure out what things are most important to your method. So a lot of the things that are listed in JARS, kind of like what Art was saying in terms of the airplane, are things that you just would normally do, maybe even without thinking about it when you're writing a manuscript, because it's just so standard. And so really thinking about what are the things that really speak to the adaptation of your methods to your specific project. Those are the things you're going to want to make sure you have space for. And so thinking about, and there may be items in the JARS that are not relevant for you because of the process that you did, and you'll just totally ignore those items and not address them. And then the third thing I was going to say is supplementary online material. That sometimes if you're writing for a journal that has very restricted page lengths, you may need to put some of the information into supplementary online material. And I've seen people do this with examples of transcripts or with their reflexivity statements. Some reflexivity statements using some qualitative methods are very, very detailed and in-depth and lengthy, and others using other methods may be briefer. So you can make a decision about what will fit well in your study. And there's a lot of flexibility in these different kinds of ways.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you so much.
Yeah. If I can just add something?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay. I was also previous editor of the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology, which is heavily quantitative and published predominantly randomized controlled trials. And as been said before, there was a tendency for the journal to have about a 25 to 30 page limit. I'm currently editor of Clinical Psychology, Science and Practice, and the typical paper that we publish is a meta-analysis or systematic review. I've set the limit at 50 pages, okay? And also very much are willing to have somebody submit 60 or 70 pages, but it gets cut down. So what I think Heidi said was incredibly important in terms of advocate for yourself. Unless an editor is not such a nice person, I've always, people have written and said, I'm exceeding the page length, but this is why. And sometimes I disagree, and sometimes I would agree. And sometimes it becomes important, but many journals have that option of putting things in a supplemental source that APA provides for. And especially when people do meta-analyses, they may have huge numbers of articles that were included. And if that was published in the text or printed in the text, then the paper length would be outrageous. So there's a number of ways to handle that. And I would not think of not using JARS simply because you're concerned about the page length.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you both for your responses there. And I'll say too, and I had mentioned this, we do have a blog post that we shared in the resources section. So if you go to the links for the webinar, we've got a link to our blog post on paper length because it is something that we do want to discuss and address, and we definitely hear the feedback about that. So I appreciate your responses too.
Can I add one more quick thing?
Absolutely.
I think just because I know we have some journal editors in
Yeah.
the room, and I think my experience having been an associate editor on journal on at Psychotherapy Research, which has a 35-page limit, what happens if you don't give people the space to describe what they're doing is that you end up having much more work for the in the review process, because almost always when I would get a paper, because I was the qualitative person, so I would get the qualitative manuscripts, they would be 35 pages. They would always be missing information that we needed for the review. So every single review was us writing to the author saying we need more information about this stuff, because we forbade them from having the space to give us that information in the beginning, which made the review a lot longer and also drained from reviewers, which is always an issue with the reviewer crisis that we're having, right? Getting reviewers who are willing to review a paper repeatedly and repeatedly. It makes it much harder if you add another review cycle right at the beginning because people didn't have space to describe their methods. Thanks.
Yeah. No, thanks for the additional information. So then I guess kind of on that note, and I think one question we received was, and Dr. Levitt, you had mentioned journal editors. So as a journal editor, how and when should JARS be implemented in their process and kind of their work?
Art, do you want to go first for this one? I don't know.
Okay, I think journal editors should use JARS. Um, I'm hoping that, and just looking at the percentages of people who responded to the question whether or not you actually ever heard or used JARS, I'm quite aware of the notion of when a new set of guidelines comes out, whether it has to do with clinical practice guidelines or research guidelines, et cetera. It's a long time before the uptake occurs. But what I'm really hoping is that more and more people start to use JARS, not use consort guidelines, but to use the JARS for a number of reasons that we're kind of saying. But I think it's almost incumbent on journal editors to have a consensus of what tends to be standardized. And I think that the concept of the replicability crisis is in part because we've had lack of standards, and having a consensus across journal editors that recommend the use of JARS becomes really important. So I would say that journal editors should always use JARS, period.
Great. Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for that. Switching gears a little bit, we've received a few questions about other sets of standards. One, and Dr. Levitt, I'll have a more specific one for you here in a bit, but just generally, what would you say, comparing to other standards, specifically those that can be found on the Equator Network, what would be the specific novelty of JARS? What makes, in your mind, kind of top level, what makes JARS stand out?
Well, I also was part of the international group of people that did the consort guidelines for what was called social and psychological research. And the reason why that came about was having to do with the notion that the regular consort guidelines tended not to really appreciate all the nuances and subtleties that psychological research entails. So again, I think that even though there was feedback from other disciplines, what JARS was developed by psychologists for psychologists having to do with psychological research. So as I mentioned before, it's not just one type of research. It cuts across all different kinds of methods, ways of interpreting topics, etc. And I think, again, it's made for psychologists. So that I think that's the unique component of that. And sometimes when people use consort guidelines, they don't appreciate some of the, again, subtleties that entails, especially in clinical psychology research.
I would say for the qualitative guidelines that one of the things that's quite unique about the JARS-Qual, and I know I was interviewed actually by someone from the Equator because they thought this was so unique that is that we really think about the idea that your methods should be tailored to your project. And so if you look at a lot of the other guidelines, there's simply a checklist of like, yes, I did this, yes, I did this, yes, I did this. And ours are not that. Ours are things that we recommend that you do, but we also talk about when should you not do those things and how different researchers and different projects may demand that you do something different. And so it's not just telling you a list of things that you should do all the time, but it's being more sophisticated, as Art was saying, more nuanced than that, and trying to help you think about when is something important, when is something else important instead.
Great, great. And
Yeah,
sorry, go ahead, Dr. Nezu.
very small thing. Again, science is not a content. Science is a process. And so when we do research, I think we have to have that big meta understanding. And I think what JAWS does is helps us to have that. So it's not, as Heidi's saying, just, check off this, check off this. That is there, but it also helps us to conceptualize and to kind of really enhance our critical thinking about these things. And that to me is, that's the reason why good research exists and why bad research, shouldn't exist.
Great, yeah. And Dr. Levitt, a follow-up for you. How would JARS-Qual or JARS for qualitative research compare to COREC, which is the Consolidated Criteria for Reporting Qualitative Research?
I think that the main way that it would compare is that it's not, it's just what I was just saying is that it's not just a checklist.
Mhm.
It's not just items, but it's actually encouraging you as a researcher to think about what does what does having strong utility mean in my study? Why should I report this thing? What are the things that I need to report given the way my methods were constructed to reach this goal versus that goal? Or how would I report something different if I'm doing a phenomenological study than a CQR study? So it's more helping you to think through the rationale and also encouraging you in your reporting to report on the rationale, right? You want to tell the reader why. Why did I implement this study in this way with these people with these methods, right? And it, again, I think as Art is saying, just to echo specifically with a focus on psychology and psychological topics, which are, often more subjective, interpersonal, relational, context dependent, systems dependent kinds of topics.
Great. Yeah. No, thank you for that. Um, so going back to, and I know we've all spoken a bit about how JARS can be a great teaching tool. Um, if we can speak a little bit more to maybe a bit why, but I think maybe also getting into what are some of the biggest mistakes you see with in relation to approach to JARS, or maybe a first time researcher, what might be a misconception that you maybe have seen come out, or a question that you've seen when researchers may be using JARS for the first time.
I think, again, with people that are coming to the research enterprise from the very beginning, there's a strong tendency, a little bit more having to do with statistics, but also in terms of research methods, almost as if there's a cookbook that exists, that always exists and always going to continue to exist and never evolve. And just the sheer fact that now we have, mixed methods and qualitative, just kind of shows how the field has grown in terms of not just only accepting, but just, the way in which we conceptualize science and how we can get information in a way that really is closer to, hopefully, the universal truth. And some, the methods that we've had before can do that. So I think that what sometimes happens is that people have this, who are new to the research enterprise, may have this way of thinking where they're going to have a sense of, well, this is the statistics that I'm going to use, and to overlay that on JARS as opposed to the opposite way. How can JARS help me to better understand and to think through this, as opposed to how can JARS fit into what I'm trying to do here? And I think that becomes important. So yeah, I think the mistake is to become much more open-minded about the different kind of approaches, even again in terms of statistical methods, et cetera. It's just because somebody else used this particular approach doesn't mean that's what you should use. What's the question that you're asking? Okay, as opposed to I have this method and that's going to help me to come up with a question. Okay, it should be the other way around.
Great,
Yeah,
thank you.
I would second that. I think that the where people get into trouble is when they just think, I'm going to use this method. This method has 5 steps or 6 steps or 3 steps. These are the steps. I did these steps. Close. Instead of thinking about how can you adapt the steps to make your method stronger, to make it so that your data is richer, is a better better at capturing the lived experience that you're studying. How can you think about changing those steps so that in the end you have findings that are going to be more effective differently, can be implemented in multiple ways, in better ways, right? These are the things that we want you to be, we're encouraging you and trying to support you to be really thoughtful in that research process.
Great.
Yeah, I think there's a tendency also, for people, again, new to the enterprise, to have these things, if my study has a 0.05, research or statistical significance, okay, I can go home, have some champagne, and maybe get the tenure, or maybe, get promoted. But, and again, what JAWS does is to make you think about, how to use statistics, for example, and the whole concept of the notion of, well, just because this test that you use to assess personality or whatever has certain kind of psychometric properties, that was based on a particular sample that the test was developed on, not necessarily with the sample that you're going to be focused on. And so therefore you have to, again, think about, is this test not valid and useful just because the test manual says it is, but is it useful for the subject population that I have now? And that's what one of the things that JAWS kind of suggests to us is that, okay, let's see what some of the psychometric properties of the test that we're using is with the population. And if it's not close to what was developed before, then something's up. So again, it helps us to really critically think about what are we doing as opposed to, oh no, this test is great, I'm going to do it, and that's it. Why are we doing it? And that becomes an important question always to ask. And hopefully we have a good answer. And JAWS, I think, helps us to come to that.
Great. So I want to switch a little bit to ask you, we received a few questions from our audience members about specifics of JARS-Qual, JARS Mixed, or JARS-Quant. We will ask a few of those here, and hopefully we can get to as many as we can. So for Dr. Levitt, this one will be for you first. How should qualitative researchers most effectively present strategies for establishing trustworthiness, such as triangulation, member checking, or audit trails within JARS, especially when faced with strict word limits? Again, this gets back to our word limit, but I think more specifically, how best to address those.
The way I often address those is to have a section that's on methodological integrity checks. And then I list all the different checks and I talk about how they address methodological integrity. I see researchers doing that more and more now, having a section where they review all of these things that they did to make the paper stronger.
Sure.
Again, if the issue is one of page lengths, things that you could do are argue with, not argue, but to request kindly from your editor to have an extended page length. You can include some material in online supplements typically, and those kind of things can be helpful. But often those sorts of checks or the things that you're doing to strengthen your method are core things to say in your method. So I'd be less likely to put those in supplementary material than other information that may be less relevant to the strength of your method.
Perfect. Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for that. And so Dr. Nezu, so for you, we do have a question for quantitative research in particular. How much of the non-significant results should be in the text results section and how much should be left to the tables?
Okay, well, it really kind of depends on when you say non-significant results. Y- What hopefully someone does is, to be able to report all the results of the study and not just, leave out some, so that we have some difficulty really understanding what the true results are. I think, again, sometimes tables are that much easier to read than putting in the text. But again, depending on how much non-significant results there are, that might be put into a supplementary deposit.
Great, thank you. And Dr. Levitt, another question for you for qualitative research. So just an audience member wanting to know if you have any specific tips for reporting small sample qualitative work. They're working with IPA or interpretive phenomenological analysis. So if you speak specifically to that. Yeah.
Sure. So in qualitative research, the sample size means something very different than in quantitative research. In quantitative research, you collect data through I mean, even the word small sample, right? You're sampling from a population with the idea of generalizing findings to that population in the end. In qualitative research, you're doing something very different. You're developing an understanding of variation, but it's a variation within the phenomenon that you're studying. It's not that you're trying to map variation within the population. And because you're not using statistics to check on that process of generalization, you're not needing to have power. And so you don't need to have numbers of participants. What you do need to have is you need to have variation within the exploration of your phenomenon. So you'd have to make a persuasive argument that the participants who you looked at and the data that was produced had sufficient variation within it to help you have a good understanding of the question that you're asking about. And so you'd be wanting to talk about what kinds of variation are really important. And it's within the scope of your question. So your question could have a narrow scope. It could be, I'm looking at women who are pediatricians who work in Massachusetts, right? It could be a narrow scope question, but within that scope, do you have experiences of variation within your participants that let you feel like you can have a strong answer for that question? If you look at the paper on the SQIP paper on recommendations for design and review on methodological integrity, we talk a lot about the idea of adequacy of data, and there's been I think just a lot of writings recently on this topic. On how when we're thinking about adequacy of data and qualitative methods, we're not thinking about generalizing to the population, but generalizing to the experience of the topic that you're studying. And so you're really going through a different kind of process of making sense of whether your data is adequate or not.
Great. No, thank you so much. We are getting a little bit close to time. I do want to ask one more question, then maybe get some final thoughts, and then we'll turn it over again to Barbara to close out. And we've seen variations of this one a bit, but I'll ask the question as we have it in chat or in Q&A. Do you see editors moving away from p-values and null hypothesis significant testing in the future?
to some degree, I wish they were. I don't see it, again, things unfortunately don't change as much as they should, for lack of consensus. I think, a lot of statisticians and some statistical associations have talked about moving away from this, quite a long time ago. And there hasn't been, a significant amount of movement. But I think, again, the notion of having multiple ways of trying to ask, different kinds of questions, from a conceptual point of view is very healthy. But my concern always is the tendency for people to think certain things are written in stone and that's the way that we should do it. And I think innovation becomes incredibly important rather than saying this is the way that it is.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you. So I think we are getting close to time. I want to give you each a chance if you want to maybe give another 30 seconds to a minute of maybe some final thoughts or anything else you want to stress or emphasize before we close out. So Dr. Levitt, do you have any kind of final thoughts or final things you want to share?
I thought I would maybe give an example of the reason why thinking about your question and having your question drive your method, as I
Sure.
was saying before, is so important. And how, and in your design and also in your reporting. So a lot of qualitative researchers now use consensus and as some sort of method. And we saw that question before that had to do with auditors. And there's this idea that we do consensus. And so you could think about, well, what does consensus mean? And what does that look like? And how does that going to fit with the kind of question that I have? So consensus could be performed in a more, what I think of as a more post-positivistic way, where the idea is just, I want to show that different people can see the same thing that I see. And so I'm going to have a bunch of people and they're going to just show that they can also see this finding in my data. And so that could be one approach. And that could be really helpful for certain things. If a goal of your study is to develop findings that many people can see, then that could be an effective and important way, right? Or using inter-rater reliability coding could be another kind of similar way of showing that people can see the same thing. And that could be very different than having a constructivist kind of approach where researchers are looking at getting consensus by thinking about why and when do we see the same thing? And why and when do we not see the same thing? And then that could be something that you write about in your reporting, right? And it's not then you're shedding light on not just the thing you studied, but also how people see the thing, which often is very important in qualitative research. Or if you're doing a critical perspective, you could do consensus in a different way by deliberately having people who embody different sorts of positionalities, different sorts of lived experiences, all looking at the data and talking about, do we see the same findings? Do we not? Are there commonalities in how and differences in how we see things? And then that becomes part of your reporting. And so depending on the goal and the question that you have, the way you go about the same thing, consensus, could be totally different and much richer and much more helpful in both your study findings and your reporting.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Thanks.
And thank you so much, Dr. Levitt. And Dr. Nezu, last final thoughts from you.
Yeah, I would encourage everybody, before you actually put pen to paper in terms of developing a new research project, is to utilize the resources that APA has on JARS. Instead of saying, how, does JARS fit into my study? It's having that kind of understanding of JARS as a way of, again, improving critical thinking and helping you to actually develop the way in which you're going to best answer that question and then go forward. So instead of saying, how does JARS fit into my study, is how do I understand research? How does JARS help me, etc. So I would encourage that. But again, thanks everybody for joining us.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. Big thanks to our panelists for this very, very valuable discussion. And thank you everyone for joining us and asking great questions. If we did not get a chance to respond, we will follow up with responses to your questions. And if you have any further comments, please contact us at apajournals@apa.org. Again, make sure to check out these additional JARS resources, including books, videos, newsletters, and more. And stay tuned for future JARS webinars. All right, thank you so much, everyone. Until next time.
Thanks, everyone.